The great kleptocracies of history, when power becomes plunder. There is a virus that has infected political power for millennia, transforming prosperous empires into machines of personal plunder. It's not a physical disease, but a corruption of the soul that turns leaders into predators of their own peoples. This virus has a name: kleptocracy, from the Greek kleptocracia, the government of thieves. Throughout history, from the magnificent courts of Rome to the golden palaces of the 20th century, we have witnessed the same devastating pattern. Leaders who confuse the public treasury with their personal bank account, who transform entire nations into their private fiefdoms, and who leave behind the financial skeleton of what were once great civilizations. This is the story of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, told through the most spectacular cases of state plunder that humanity has known. Chapter 1. Rome, the empire that devoured itself. Caligula, when madness dresses in purple. In the year 37 AD, a 25-year-old man named Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known as Caligula, ascended to the throne of the Roman Empire. What followed was one of the most spectacular demonstrations of how absolute power can transform a man into a machine of squandering. Caligula inherited an imperial treasury filled to the brim thanks to the frugality of his predecessor Tiberius. In less than a year, he had spent everything. 2.7 billion sestertii evaporated in obscene banquets, circus games that lasted weeks, and whims that defied logic. He built a floating bridge 3 miles long over the Bay of Naples simply to ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's armor. He organized a war against Poseidon, ordering his legions to attack the waves and collect seashells as spoils of war. He appointed his favorite horse, Incitatus, as consul, having built it a marble stable with ivory feeders. When the treasury was exhausted, Caligula invented demented taxes. He taxed lawsuits, marriages, divorces, and even prostitution. He sold gladiators at exorbitant prices, forcing wealthy citizens to bid against themselves. He confiscated properties through invented accusations of treason, turning the judicial system into an extortion machine. The emperor who had promised to restore greatness to Rome ended up destroying imperial finances in 4 years. His assassination in 41 AD was as much a political act as an economic emergency measure. Nero, the artist of waste. If Caligula was madness made emperor, Nero was vanity converted into a plundering machine. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who would rule as Nero from 54 to 68 AD, was not content with spending the public treasury on whims. He turned it into a tool to finance his megalomaniacal artistic fantasies. Nero dreamed of being remembered as the greatest artist in history. To finance this dream, he systematically stripped the empire. He built the Domus Aurea, a palace that covered a third of Rome, with an artificial lake the size of a sea, a 30-meter bronze colossus with his own image, and rooms covered in gold and precious stones. When the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD destroyed much of the city, Nero saw an opportunity. While citizens lost their homes, He expanded his palace over the ruins. Suspicions that he had started the fire to have space for his architectural megalomania never faded. To finance his excesses, Nero perfected the art of legal confiscation. He accused wealthy senators of treason, confiscated their properties, and then executed them to prevent them from claiming. He debased Roman currency, adding base metals to create more money with less real silver and gold. His artistic tours through Greece were plundering expeditions disguised as cultural events. Nero won more than 1,800 crowns in competitions where he was the only participant, while his soldiers looted temples and works of art to finance the spectacle. The emperor, who believed himself to be a misunderstood artist, died as a fugitive, while Rome burned in fiscal rebellions that he himself had provoked with his insatiable appetite for luxury. Chapter 2: Versailles, the golden machine that devoured France. Louis XIV. The state is me, and my treasury too. In 1661, when Louis XIV declared that he would rule France without a prime minister, few could have predicted that he was initiating the most elegant and devastating state plundering operation in European history. For 72 years, the Sun King turned France into his personal property, and Versailles into the most scandalous symbol of power devouring itself. Versailles was not simply a palace. It was a declaration of war against the French economy. Louis XIV transformed a hunting lodge into a golden city that employed 36,000 people and cost 25% of the national budget annually just in maintenance. The Hall of Mirrors, with its 357 handmade mirrors, costs more than the annual military budget. André Le Nôtre's gardens required the work of 1,400 permanent gardeners. The fountains only worked when the king walked by because the cost of water was prohibitive even for the French crown. Louis XIV instituted a system of etiquette so complex that French nobility was trapped in Versailles like golden butterflies in a web of protocol. Dukes ruined their fortunes buying the right to hand the king his shirt each morning. Marquises mortgaged their lands to afford appropriate attire for a single royal dinner. But Louis XIV's true genius was psychological. He turned plunder into spectacle. France's finances bled, but they did so with such magnificence that it seemed like a divine act. Foreign ambassadors were dazzled by the splendor, while French peasants sold their children to pay the taxes that financed that grandeur. When Louis XIV died in 1715, France was on the verge of bankruptcy. His deathbed was surrounded by gold and tapestries while his kingdom crumbled under the weight of 72 years of parasitic magnificence. Louis XV and Louis XVI, the heirs of disaster. Louis XIV's successors inherited both his palace and his system of institutionalized plunder. Louis XV continued the tradition of confusing France with his personal property, while Louis XVI, weaker but equally spendthrift, carried the system to its inevitable collapse. Madame de Pompadour, Louis XV's official mistress, spent fortunes equivalent to entire countries' GDP on her whims. Her dresses cost more than the annual salary of 1,000 workers. Her parties at Versailles lasted weeks and required importing exotic products from French colonies. Marie Antoinette elevated waste to artistic levels. Her artificial village at Versailles, where she played at being a shepherdess with washed and perfumed sheep, cost more than building 50 real schools. Her dresses required the work of hundreds of artisans for months, while Paris filled with beggars. The system had created its own perverse logic. The French economy existed to maintain the spectacle of Versailles, and Versailles existed to demonstrate that France was rich enough to afford such waste. It was a vicious circle of parasitic magnificence that could only end in collapse. The Revolution of 1789 was not just a political uprising. It was a fiscal insurrection. The French people finally rebelled against a system that had turned them into involuntary financiers of history's most expensive casino. Chapter 3: The Tsars, Russia's Golden Winter. The Romanovs, when cold dresses and diamonds. For 3 centuries, the Romanov dynasty perfected the art of extracting wealth from Russia's vastness to create a world of luxury that rivaled any Oriental fantasy. From Peter the Great to Nicholas II, the Russian Tsars transformed a country of serfs into a personal gold mine, creating such a grotesque contrast between imperial magnificence and popular misery that it would eventually dynamite the entire system. Peter the Great began the tradition with St. Petersburg, a city literally built on the bones of serfs who died constructing it. 100,000 workers perished creating the Venice of the North. But Peter achieved his objective, a capital that would dazzle Europe while Russia bled financially. Catherine the Great took imperial plunder to unprecedented levels of sophistication. Her art collection at the Hermitage was built by purchasing entire collections from ruined European nobles. Her palaces contain more gold than many countries' reserves. Her jewels included the Orlov, a 189-carat diamond, and a collection of Fabergés that represented the work of the finest artisans for decades. The Winter Palace became a parallel universe where a single room contained more wealth than entire cities. The throne room was literally lined with gold, while the ballrooms required the work of hundreds of serfs just to be heated during the Russian winter. But the true perversion of the Tsarist system was its economic logic. Russia existed to maintain the lifestyle of a single family, while 90% of the population lived in medieval conditions. Serfs worked lands they could never own to finance parties they would never be invited to. Nicholas II, the last act of the Golden Theatre. Nicholas II, the last Tsar, inherited not only a throne but an economic system designed for systematic plunder. His coronation in 1896 cost more than the empire's annual education budget, while the ceremony included distributing gold souvenirs to foreign guests. The imperial family possessed properties spanning territories the size of European countries. Their private yachts were more luxurious than most European monarchs' palaces. Tsarina Alexandra spent fortunes on French jewelers while Russian soldiers marched barefoot to World War I. The contrast became unsustainable when Rasputin, the Siberian mystic, began influencing imperial decisions. Spending orgies continued even while Russia lost battles for lack of basic equipment. Soldiers died of hunger while the imperial court organized balls that lasted until dawn. The revolution of 1917 was not just the end of the Romanovs. It was the violent response of a country that finally understood it had been turned into one family's personal property. 3 centuries of systematic plunder ended in a basement in Ekaterinburg, where the last imperial family paid the price for generations of golden parasitism. Chapter 4: Modern Dictators, Plunder in the Industrial Age. Ferdinand Marcos. The Philippines as a personal bank account. In 1965, when Ferdinand Marcos assumed the presidency of the Philippines, few could have imagined they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most systematic state plundering operations of the 20th century. For 21 years, Marcos and his wife Imelda transformed a tropical archipelago into their personal vault, perfecting corruption techniques that would be studied in political science schools for decades. Marcos understood that in the modern era, effective plunder required legal sophistication. He created a labyrinth of martial law that allowed him to confiscate properties for national security. He established state monopolies in key industries but ran them as family businesses. Philippine sugar, coconut, and tobacco passed through companies controlled by the Marcos family before reaching international markets. Imelda Marcos became the most visible symbol of state parasitism. Her 3,000 pairs of shoes were just the tip of the iceberg. She owned properties in New York valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, an art collection that included masterpieces stolen from Philippine museums, and jewelry whose value exceeded the national education budget. Malacanang Palace was transformed into a surreal stage where the Marcos family recreated European royal life, while Manila filled with slums. Their themed parties required importing Hollywood decorators, while Philippine hospitals lacked basic medicines. The Marcos system functioned like a suction machine. Every peso that entered the Philippine economy was filtered through shell companies controlled by the presidential family. International loans were diverted to Swiss accounts, while the Philippines' external debt multiplied to finance one family's imperial lifestyle. When Marcos fled in 1986, investigations revealed the magnitude of the plunder. Between $5 and $10 billion extracted from the Philippine economy, while the country languished in poverty for 2 decades. Nicolae Ceausescu, Romania's economic Dracula. Nicolae Ceausescu ruled Romania from 1965 to 1989, as if he were the owner of a company with 23 million poorly paid employees. His regime perfected the art of combining socialist rhetoric with capitalist plunder, creating one of the most bizarre kleptocratic systems in European history. Ceausescu built the People's Palace, now Parliament Palace, the world's second-largest building after the Pentagon. Its construction required demolishing a quarter of Bucharest's historic center, and cost more than Romania's annual GDP. The palace contained 1,100 rooms, many of which were never used, while Romanians stood in line for hours to buy bread. The Romanian dictator lived in a parallel universe of abundance while his people experienced systematic scarcity. His private residence included a heated pool, indoor tropical gardens, and a personal zoo, while Romania exported all its food production to pay for the regime's whims. Elena Ceausescu, his wife, proclaimed herself a brilliant scientist and accumulated honorary doctorates while she couldn't read properly. Her scientific laboratories were actually workshops where artisans created luxury objects for the presidential family, financed with research budgets. The regime implemented a rationing system that kept the population on the edge of survival while the Ceausescus accumulated gold, art, and foreign currency in secret accounts. The contrast was so grotesque that when they were finally executed in 1989, the Romanian people looted their residences looking for the food they had been hoarding. Mobutu Sese Seko, the Congo's leopard king. Mobutu Sese Seko ruled Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo, from 1965 to 1997, as if he were the absolute monarch of a diamond and copper nature reserve the size of Western Europe. His kleptocracy reached such spectacular levels that the term Mobutuism became synonymous with systemic state plunder. Mobutu understood that controlling Congo's natural resources was equivalent to owning a money-printing machine. He nationalized diamond, copper, and cobalt mines but operated them as family businesses. Mining contracts passed through shell companies controlled by his relatives, while Congolese workers received subsistence wages. His personal fleet included the Concorde he rented to take his family shopping in Paris. His residences in France, Belgium, and Switzerland contain more African art than many European museums, art that had been nationalized and then donated to the presidential family. Badalite, his hometown, was transformed into a tropical fantasy with palaces rivaling Versailles, landing strips for private jets, and gardens that required importing water from Europe because the local system had been contaminated by uncontrolled mining. The Congolese dictator perfected the art of international corruption, selling mining concessions to Western companies that paid bribes directly to his personal accounts. Meanwhile, Congo, one of the world's richest countries in natural resources, sank into absolute poverty. When Mobutu was overthrown in 1997, he had accumulated a personal fortune estimated at $4 billion, while Congo became one of the planet's poorest countries. Chapter 5: Anatomy of Parasitism, Universal Patterns. The DNA of kleptocracy. Across centuries and continents, great kleptocracies have followed surprisingly similar patterns, as if there existed a secret manual of state plunder passed from one generation of despots to the next. These patterns reveal that kleptocracy is not an accident of history, but a specific form of political organization with its own internal logic and operating rules. The principle of patrimonial confusion. All great kleptocrats have begun by erasing the line between public and private. Caligula declared that Rome was his personal property. Louis XIV proclaimed that the state is me. Marcos treated the Philippines as his family business. This confusion is not accidental. It is the psychological foundation that enables large-scale plunder. The genuine kleptocrat doesn't see himself as a thief, but as the legitimate owner of everything he governs. In his mind, he isn't stealing the public treasury. He's managing his personal property. This self-deception is crucial because it allows him to operate without the moral limits that would constrain a simple corrupt official. The aesthetics of absolute power. All great kleptocracies have understood that effective plunder requires spectacle. Luxury is not simply a consequence of power, it is a tool to maintain it. Versailles dazzled visitors into submission. Marcos's palaces intimidated the opposition with their magnificence. Ceausescu's military parades hypnotized the people with their grandeur. Spectacle serves multiple functions. It convinces the population that the leader is almost divine, deters political rivals by showing them the cost of challenging such power, and creates an alternative reality, where plunder seems natural and inevitable. The system of forced complicity. Great kleptocrats never operate alone. They create systems that force elites to become accomplices in their plunder. Louis XIV trapped French nobility at Versailles, forcing them to ruin themselves to maintain appearances. Marcos distributed crumbs of his loot among generals and businessmen to ensure their loyalty. Mobutu created a network of bribes that turned any important official into his criminal partner. This complicity is strategic. When everyone is tainted, no one can denounce the system without denouncing themselves. Accomplices become moral hostages of the main kleptocrat. The economy of artificial scarcity. Paradoxically, kleptocracies function best when the general population lives in scarcity, while leaders swim in abundance. This scarcity is not accidental. It is deliberately manufactured to maximize political control. When people struggle to survive, they have no energy to rebel. When basic needs are controlled by the state, political dependence becomes total. Ceausescu rationed food while accumulating banquets. The Romanovs distributed land to serfs while possessing infinite territories. The technical mechanisms of plunder. The monetization of legality. Modern kleptocrats have perfected the art of legalizing theft. They create laws that appear to serve the public interest but actually channel resources toward their personal accounts. State monopolies nationalize companies, public contracts without bidding. Everything becomes a mechanism to transfer public wealth to private accounts. Marcos was a master of this technique. His martial law allowed him to confiscate properties for national security, but the properties always ended up in the hands of companies controlled by his family. The internationalization of loot. Modern kleptocrats have learned to globalize their plunder, turning the international financial system into their involuntary accomplice. They open accounts in tax havens, buy properties in countries with weak legal systems, and move money through banking networks that make tracking nearly impossible. Mobutu maintained accounts in Switzerland, properties in France, and shell companies in Liechtenstein. When he was finally overthrown, His fortune was so internationally dispersed that Congo could never recover more than a fraction of what had been stolen. Information manipulation. All great kleptocracies have obsessively controlled information flow, not just to avoid criticism, but to create alternative realities where their plunder seems justified or even heroic. Ceausescu controlled all Romanian media and used them to present his megalomania as patriotism. Marcos used propaganda to convince Filipinos that his corruption was actually a form of economic nationalism. Louis XIV created a protocol system so elaborate that his parasitism seemed like a divine spectacle. Chapter 6. The Human Cost of Golden Plunder. When numbers have faces. Behind every great kleptocracy lies a sinister mathematical equation. For every euro spent on imperial luxuries, hundreds of citizens lose access to education, health, or simply food. But statistics don't capture the true human dimension of state parasitism. To understand the real cost of great kleptocracies, one must descend from golden palaces to the lives that were sacrificed to build them. The theorem of inverted magnificence. There exists a perfect correlation between the kleptocrat's magnificence and his people's misery. The more spectacular the palace, the more devastating the poverty. The more exclusive the banquets, the more widespread the hunger. This is not coincidence. It is economic physics. When Marcos built his art collection valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, the Philippines had the highest infant mortality rate in Southeast Asia. While Imelda bought jewelry in Paris, Philippine hospitals lacked basic antibiotics. Money is finite. Every peso spent on designer shoes was a peso not spent on vaccines. Kleptocratic magnificence is not simply immoral. It is mathematically cruel. It represents the systematic transfer of resources from the basic needs of millions to the whims of one. The lost generations. Perhaps the most devastating cost of great kleptocracies is entire generations that grew up in societies designed to finance one family's excesses. These children never knew adequate schools, functional hospitals, or simply the hope that personal effort could improve their lives. In Romania under Ceausescu, an entire generation grew up malnourished while the dictator built pharaonic palaces. Romanian children of the 1980s were systematically shorter and weaker than their parents, victims of an economy designed to feed one man's megalomania. In Zaire under Mobutu, life expectancy fell 15 years during his regime, while he accumulated one of the world's largest personal fortunes. A country with sufficient natural resources to be prosperous became synonymous with extreme poverty, because all its wealth flowed to a single bank account. The perversion of national priorities. Kleptocracies create a complete moral inversion of national priorities. Instead of the state existing to serve the people exist to maintain the state, or more precisely, to maintain the kleptocrat who controls the state. In Louis XIV France, peasants sold their children as servants to pay taxes that would finance a decorative fountain at Versailles. In Marcos's Philippines, Entire families emigrated as domestic workers to Arab countries to send remittances that would end up financing Imelda's shopping in New York. This is not simply bad government. It is a form of economic cannibalism where a society devours itself to feed its head. The psychology of collaborationism. Why do people tolerate the intolerable? One of the most disturbing questions about great kleptocracies is why populations tolerate them for so long. How can irrational people allow a single family to systematically steal their future? The answer reveals the psychological sophistication of great kleptocrats. They don't simply steal. They create mental systems that make theft seem natural, inevitable, or even desirable. The strategy of hypnotic magnificence. Kleptocrats understand that humans are programmed to admire power and wealth, even when that wealth is stolen. Versailles didn't just impress foreigners. It hypnotized common French people, who felt vicarious pride in living in the country of the world's most magnificent king. This vicarious pride is a psychological trap. People confuse their exploiters' greatness with their own greatness. Poor Filipinos felt proud when Imelda appeared in international fashion magazines, without understanding that her elegance was financed with money stolen from them. National Stockholm Syndrome. In the long term, populations subjected to kleptocracies develop a form of collective Stockholm Syndrome. They begin to identify with their exploiters and defend the system that oppresses them. Romanians under Ceausescu defended their national independence, without understanding that this independence consisted of being exploited by a local kleptocrat instead of a foreign one. Russians under the Tsars felt patriotic pride in imperial grandeur, without connecting that grandeur to their own misery. Social atomization. Successful kleptocrats deliberately fragment social resistance, creating systems where each individual struggles alone to survive, and has no energy to organize collectively. When all mental energy is consumed in getting food and shelter, there's no space left for political resistance. Mobutu perfected this technique by keeping Congolese on the edge of survival, while distributing small privileges among select groups. No one had enough power to challenge him, but everyone had enough fear of losing what little they had. Chapter 7. The Collapse. When reality collects the bill. The physics of parasitism. Why all kleptocracies collapse. There exists a natural law of political parasitism. No kleptocracy can survive indefinitely because it eventually exhausts its host. Like a virus that kills its host, the most successful kleptocrats sow the seeds of their own destruction at the moment of their maximum triumph. The lethal equilibrium point. Every kleptocracy eventually reaches a lethal equilibrium point. The moment when the cost of maintaining the plunder system exceeds the national economy's capacity to sustain it. This point is mathematically inevitable because kleptocrats' appetite grows exponentially while their country's productive capacity deteriorates under the weight of systematic extraction. Louis XIV reached this point around 1700, when France spent more maintaining Versailles than it collected in taxes from the entire kingdom. Marcos reached it in the 1980s, when Philippine external debt exceeded the country's ability to pay it, even selling all its natural resources. The lethal equilibrium point is also psychological. It's when the population finally understands that the system is unsustainable, and their survival depends on destroying those who have been parasitizing them. Versailles Syndrome. When opulence becomes political. Great kleptocrats suffer from a specific form of political blindness. They confuse their golden isolation with real security. The more opulent their palaces become, the less they understand what's happening in the real world. Marie Antoinette played at being a shepherdess in her artificial village while Paris filled with revolutionaries. Marcos organized themed parties at Malacanang while Manila boiled with protests. Ceausescu built palaces while Romania disintegrated economically. This blindness is not accidental. It's the inevitable result of living in an artificial universe where all information is filtered by courtiers whose survival depends on keeping the kleptocrats happy. The rebellion of reality. Eventually, economic reality becomes impossible to ignore or manipulate. The numbers simply stop working. There isn't enough money to maintain both the kleptocratic spectacle and the state's basic functions. This is the most dangerous moment for any kleptocrat, because it's when he must choose between reducing his personal plunder or increasing repression to maintain it. Most choose repression, but this accelerates collapse because repression costs money they no longer have. Terminal symptoms. All kleptocracies show the same symptoms in their terminal phase. Uncontrolled hyperinflation as they print money to finance expenses they can't cover with taxes. Massive brain drain when educated citizens abandon the country. Deterioration of basic infrastructure because the entire budget is diverted to maintaining the kleptocratic apparatus. Growing protests that the regime can no longer buy off or repress effectively. International isolation when other countries begin to see the regime as a risk to regional stability. The mechanisms of collapse. The French Revolution, the classic model. The collapse of the French monarchy remains the most studied example of how a kleptocracy self-destructs. Louis XVI inherited a system designed for systematic plunder, but he also inherited the contradictions that would make that system unsustainable. In 1789, France spent 50% of its national budget paying interest on debts contracted to finance previous kings' wars and luxuries. The fiscal system was so perverted that the richest, nobility and clergy, were exempt from taxes, while the poorest financed a state that ignored them completely. The convocation of the Estates General was an act of fiscal desperation, but it became the mechanism for destroying the system itself. Once the people's representatives gathered and began calculating how much had been stolen, and for how long, revolution became inevitable. Marcos's perestroika. When reform accelerates collapse. Marcos attempted to reform his system in the 1980s when it became clear that the Philippines couldn't sustain his level of plunder. But kleptocratic reforms are impossible because any real transparency reveals the magnitude of theft that has been occurring. When Marcos allowed democratic, elections in 1986, he didn't anticipate that the opposition would use the campaign to publicly document decades of corruption. International media began calculating how much Philippine money was deposited in Swiss accounts while Philippine hospitals lacked basic equipment. The people power revolution that overthrew Marcos was not an emotional explosion. It was a mathematical rebellion by a people who finally understood the numbers of their own exploitation. Ceausescu's end. When spectacle becomes counterproductive. Nicolae Ceausescu was overthrown partly because his megalomania led him to organize public spectacles at a time when the Romanian population could no longer be fooled by propaganda. His last public speech in December 1989 was interrupted by boos from a crowd that had been summoned to acclaim him. But the problem wasn't the crowd. It was that Ceausescu had lost the ability to read his people's real mood after decades of living in a bubble of forced adulation. The collapse was so rapid, less than a week from the last speech to his execution, that it revealed how fragile his power had really been. All the magnificence, all the repression, all the spectacle disintegrated in days once the population lost its fear. Epilogue: The Eternal Lessons of Golden Plunder. Why this history matters. In an era when democracies seem solid and institutions seem permanent, the history of great kleptocracies might seem like a catalogue of historical curiosities. Cautionary tales about more primitive times that humanity has definitively surpassed. This perspective would be dangerously naive. Kleptocracy is not an archaic form of government that has been relegated to history museums. It is a permanent temptation of political power, a corruption that can infect any system when institutional controls weaken and citizens lower their guard. The basic mechanisms haven't changed. The confusion between public and private, the concentration of power without accountability, the creation of complicity networks that protect systematic corruption. Only the techniques have evolved, adapting to new technologies and new legal systems. Kleptocracy and democracy. Modern democracies are not immune to systematic corruption. They simply develop more sophisticated versions of the same virus. Instead of openly declaring that the state is me, modern kleptocrats create legal labyrinths that produce the same result: the systematic transfer of public resources to private accounts. No-bid contracts, state companies operating as family businesses, regulations favoring specific companies, inflated budgets including astronomical representation expenses. All are modern versions of techniques perfected by Louis XIV, Marcos, and Mobutu. The difference is that in democracies, these techniques must be camouflaged under the language of legality and public good. But the final result is identical: a political class that treats public resources as their personal patrimony. Warning symptoms. The history of great kleptocracies teaches us to recognize early warning symptoms. When political leaders live with luxuries they cannot justify with their official salaries. When public officials' families mysteriously enrich themselves during their relatives' service. when public contracts systematically go to the same politically connected companies, when government transparency decreases under pretexts of security or efficiency, when criticizing corruption becomes dangerous or is dismissed as politicization. These symptoms appear long before final collapse, when it's still possible to correct course without violent revolutions. Civic responsibility. Perhaps the most important lesson from great kleptocracies is that they are not simply the result of evil leaders who accidentally appear in power. They are the result of societies that gradually abdicate their responsibility to watch those who govern. The French didn't wake up one day in 1789 and discover they had been financing Versailles for a century. They knew it all along, but found ways to rationalize, ignore, or feel vicariously proud of a system that was systematically impoverishing them. Filipinos knew Marcos was corrupt long before 1986, but many believed that at least he was our corrupt, and that his theft was somehow less harmful than foreign domination. Romanians knew that Ceausescu lived in palaces while they stood in line to buy bread, but were convinced this was the price of national independence. The price of complacency. Citizen complacency is kleptocracy's fertilizer. Every time a society decides that politics is dirty anyway, and withdraws from public scrutiny, it creates the space kleptocrats need to operate. Every time citizens accept small corruption because that's how things are, or because everyone does it, they normalize the conditions that will allow big corruption. Every time a society decides it can ignore politics while the economy is doing well, it loses the ability to detect when that economy is being secretly plundered. The future of kleptocracy. New technologies, old vices. The 21st century presents both new opportunities and new dangers for potential kleptocrats. On one hand, digital technology allows unprecedented levels of transparency. It's harder to hide financial transactions, easier to document corruption, and faster to mobilize citizen resistance. On the other hand, the same technology allows new forms of plunder. Cryptocurrencies can hide international transfers, information systems can be manipulated to create alternative realities, and social networks can be used to fragment political resistance. Future kleptocrats won't need to build Versailles to demonstrate their power. They can create virtual universes where their magnificence seems real, while their real bank accounts grow in digital darkness. The democratization of surveillance. But technology has also democratized the capacity to watch power. Smartphones can document corruption, social networks can organize resistance, and information systems can analyze patterns of public spending that were previously invisible. The crucial question is whether societies will develop the political will to use these tools before it's too late, or whether they will allow new kleptocrats to develop technological countermeasures faster than citizens can adapt. The final call. This history of great kleptocracies is not just a tour through past crimes. It is a risk map for the future. Names will change, techniques will evolve, but the fundamental temptation will remain. Power without controls tends toward corruption, and corruption without resistance tends toward systematic plunder. The only real defense against kleptocracy is an educated, vigilant citizenry committed to maintaining transparency of public power, not because politicians are inherently evil, but because power without surveillance corrupts even well-intentioned people. The magnificence of Versailles, Marcos's palaces, Mobutu's Swiss accounts, all are monuments to what happens when societies allow a single person or family to treat public resources as private property. Let this history serve not as historical entertainment, but as a vaccine against a political virus that has never been completely eradicated and is always looking for new societies to infect. Eternal vigilance is not just the price of freedom. It is the price of preventing our resources, our future, and our children's future from becoming the loot of the next kleptocrats who dream of building their own golden versions of Versailles. Power must serve the people, not the people serve power. This is the simplest lesson and the easiest to forget in all of human history. Are we really free from these dynamics? Or are we still trapped in new versions of the same story?